Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Well, Happy New Year. It's 2025. 2024 was eventful and busy and many things going on in the world. And it's always nice to start a new year. So I'm hoping that everyone is out there and doing well and staying safe. Okay, so I am having a few upcoming conversations on a sensitive topic. It's a topic that polarizes a lot of people, something that makes people very upset, rightfully so, on either side of things. I've waited some time to have these discussions because I wanted to get some time away from things, see how things play out, see how things are. And I just want to be clear, I don't personally have a kind of stake in any one thing here. I'm trying to have honest conversations with very good people, like I've done for almost 400 episodes at this point. So, this isn't for me about taking sides or things like that. And so two things here I want to say at the front of this episode and a few other episodes. My aim, and what I think my guest aim today, is to see the humanity in people. And there's obviously difficult political challenges and humanitarian challenges and ethical questions and all of these things, but really getting it focused on human beings and people that are involved, and not forsake that, not make it about scoring political points or who's more right or who has their history the most accurate. And those conversations are out there, and that's fine. But the real, I think, centrality of this and what I think the conversation gets to is the humanity of many people. And there's no hate in this conversation whatsoever. Really is trying to understand and make sense of things. That's what my guest does. That's what I'm trying to do. And so people can have strong opinions, but I hope that people walk away understanding, at the very least, the best version of my guest's point of view. That's what I try to do, and to really see the humanity in people. So today, I am very honored and very privileged to talk with Nathan Thrall. Nathan is an American writer. He lives in Jerusalem, and he is the author of the book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy, in which he received the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction last year. It's been translated in over 24 languages. It's won many awards. For him, his writing has appeared everywhere. The Guardian, the New York Times Magazine, New York Review of Books. He's been longlisted for many other awards as well, and you can find him in many other outlets. We start this conversation by talking about how he wanted to use narrative to discuss the Palestinian experience in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and other parts in the region. We give an overview of sort of the geography. We talk about the wall, the West Bank, all these things, so people kind of know what we're talking about and kind of just parachute people in there. We talk about big concepts. We talk about sovereign rights. We talk about the idea of home. We talk about the color ID cards that Palestinians have to use in the West Bank. We talk about the first intifada in 1987. I believe we touch on the second intifada as well. We obviously talk about October 7th. We talk about the future of Israel-Palestine relations and many other topics. Nathan is a good guy. His writing is spectacular. And he, like myself, is trying to just share human stories and have people, see a little bit more about the humanity of things. And so I think he's very good at doing that through his writing, and just through him as a person. So it was a lot of fun. Learned a lot in this conversation, and I hope listeners do as well. As always, you can find this podcast and this conversation over at Converging Dialogues at substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So if you like the podcast, follow it, subscribe, like, share with your friends. all the things. And now I bring you Nathan Thrall. I am here with Nathan Thrall. Nathan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you've written a wonderful book. It's called A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, which is also won the Pulitzer. So congrats on that.
Thank you.
It's a great book. As we were talking before we started, I think it really focuses on the humanity of folks. Obviously, it's a tense subject. So I'm excited to talk all about it with you. I think you treat this pretty well. Before we get into it, why don't you tell listeners who you are, just sort of your kind of snapshot of the background of yourself, all the relevant details, and kind of bring us up to speed where you're at presently.
Sure. So I've lived in Jerusalem since 2011. I spent a decade working for an international organization called the International Crisis Group. It's a conflict resolution organization that works in dozens of conflict areas all over the world. And what we did at the International Crisis Group was really in-depth, on-the-ground reporting and political analysis that was relied on by journalists and policymakers and others. And in 2020, I decided to leave that job and work on this book. And the reason that I did that is really I had a kind of a realization that the work that I was doing for Crisis Group was not really going to make much of a difference. And the reason was that the conversation among those who have power on this issue is very, very limited. And there are lots of people who have positions of power who believe that the policies that they're supporting are immoral and yet are unwilling to really do anything about it themselves. And the reason is that they don't feel that they have the room to do it. They feel like the politics on this issue only allow for a tiny degree of movement, the kind of thing that won't really make a difference here. And they're not willing to, end their careers, lose their jobs for something that's not even going to succeed anyway. So I decided after a decade of talking to folks like those and trying to influence them that what I really ought to be doing is writing stories. I ought to be trying to reach a broader audience that can help create a different kind of atmosphere, a different environment in which those policymakers operate. One in which ordinary folks would understand better what's happening here, and in the U.S. in particular would understand better what the U.S. has been supporting for decades. And that really came out of a conviction that ordinary Americans, when they come here and they see this place, they'll be horrified by what they see. And I've seen it time and again when delegations come, whether it's members of Congress or congressional staffers or others, when they come in the West Bank, within a few hours of being there, they are shocked. They're shocked at a system of naked ethnic oppression and domination by one group over another, by Israeli Jews over Palestinians. And they come away from that experience mortified at their own complicity in it. And so what I really wanted to do was to give a reader a feel of what it's like to be on one of those bus tours, some approximation of that, of just entering the West Bank and seeing it with your own eyes. Because what I do see is that when those Americans do come and visit, they are spontaneously making connections, historical connections to apartheid in South Africa, to Jim Crow, and nobody's leading them to that. It's just staring them in the face. So I thought that the best way to do that is to find a story and to really, through narrative, to allow people to see what life is like for Palestinians living in this system. So that was the kind of philosophical change that I had in 2020 when I decided to leave Crisis Group and work on this book. And since then, I've been living here. I'm an American Jew, have been writing about this issue for many, many years. And now I'm planning to continue on this path of really focusing on storytelling and narrative.
Mm. Yeah, there is something very powerful with narrative, and when I was reading the book, I was curious about what was it that made you want to tell this story in particular. I'm sure there's thousands of stories to tell, and I'm sure you'll continue to tell more of them, which is great. But what was it about this story that you felt was helpful to explain sort of the situation, excuse me, in Jerusalem and in the West Bank and the larger area? What was it about this story in particular that really was like, yes, this will capture what I'm trying to say? And maybe you just kind of give the kind of summary of the story.
Sure. So, I mean, really, it was a number of different elements that converged. One is I was just deeply moved by this story. I tell the story of a tragic bus accident involving a group of Palestinian kindergartners in the greater Jerusalem area. They live on the other side of a 26-foot tall concrete wall that encircles their community. This wall surrounds them on three sides, and on a fourth side, they have a different kind of wall running through a segregated road with Israeli traffic on one side, Palestinian traffic on the other, often called the Apartheid Road, Route 4370. So these people are totally enclosed by walls. They're living in a walled ghetto. They receive virtually no services from the municipality of Jerusalem. You have emergency services that will even refuse to enter these areas without an army or police escort. So people are left there without sidewalks, without playgrounds, with a huge shortage of classrooms, and all of this in plain sight of the upper middle class Jewish communities and settlements just on the other side of the wall. And what I tell is the story of a kindergarten that exists inside this walled ghetto, where a kindergarten class had planned to take an excursion to a play area. And because of a complex permit system that restricts the movements of Palestinians in Jerusalem, they couldn't just go to the play areas on the other side of the wall. So they had to go along a winding path next to the wall, pass through a checkpoint, and try to reach a distant play area on the outskirts of Ramallah. And just after passing through this checkpoint, the school bus, was struck by a huge semi-trailer. The bus flipped over. It caught fire. 6 children and 1 teacher died. And this occurred on a road that's used almost entirely by Palestinians. So all the people who saw the accident, who pulled over on their way to work that morning and tried to help rescue these children from this burning bus were Palestinian. And they were desperately calling for Israeli emergency services to come because this is an area under full Israeli administrative control, under full Israeli jurisdiction. Israeli police give out traffic tickets on this road. And it was more than a half an hour before the first Israeli fire truck arrived on the scene. And for me, this story of what happened on that day was emblematic of the utter and deliberate neglect that these hundreds of thousands of people are living under on the other side of the wall. And through the story of some of the teachers and parents and children, Abed Salama, who's in the title of the book, is the father of one of the kindergartners. Through the story of the parents and teachers and children, also the Jewish settlers who live right next to the accident site, settlers who work in the emergency services, Israeli nurses and medical personnel. I really try and tell the whole story of Israel-Palestine, not just through the story of this day, but also through the life stories and family stories of the people whose lives collided in this crash. And one of the reasons why an accident was so important to choose as a narrative is that the people in this area live such segregated lives. And you have, Palestinian-only communities side by side with Jewish-only communities. Often those Jewish-only communities are built on the land of the Palestinian community next door. And they have almost no interaction with one another. But through an event like this, through a tragic road accident, I could have a narrative that would bring all these different people together. And the other element here is that, the Jerusalem area is so important to telling the bigger story of Israel-Palestine. It's the center of the Israeli settlement project. More than half of the Israeli settlers live in the greater Jerusalem area. It's the number one priority area for settlement. It's the area that Israel is most determined to make as Jewish as possible, with as few Palestinians as possible, in order to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. So those were the factors that made this, in a kind of abstract and intellectual way, a very good fit for the kind of story that I wanted to tell. Another factor was that, I was writing at a time when there was so much discussion of apartheid in Israel-Palestine. There were leading Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations who were writing reports finding that Israel was practicing apartheid. You had senior Israeli officials like the highest legal authority in Israel, the former Attorney General of Israel, saying Israel is practicing apartheid, the former head of the Mossad saying that Israel is practicing apartheid, and you had the UN Human Rights Council, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all of them coming out and saying Israel is practicing apartheid. But they were doing it in a very legal way. It wasn't about an epithet or a kind of loose analogy to South Africa. It was about a specific legal definition of apartheid, which is, one group dominating over another group with the intention of maintaining that system of domination. And so those reports were enormously valuable, but they were legalistic and they were abstract. They were looking at this from a bird's eye view. And what I felt was really important was for people to see it at the human level, to see what it actually means to navigate through the system. And through the story of Abed and his quest to find his son, his inability to get through checkpoints because of the color of his permit, his need to call on relatives who had the right color permit to go check on his son at various hospitals that he was told his son was at. Just the entire journey that he goes through checkpoints and segregated roads over a period of more than a day, just to find out what has happened to his son, where his son might be located, was a very good way, actually, to explain how the system actually works, what it means for people. And then through his life story and through his family story, I could also, tell the story of the occupation. He's born shortly after the occupation began. He comes from a very prominent family in a town, Anata, that was slowly taken over by Israeli settlements and military bases and outposts and settler roads and infrastructure. That's now a tiny rump of what it once was. And he lived through these momentous events over the last, 50 plus years in Israel-Palestine. He graduated from high school just before the first intifada broke out. He was pulled into the first intifada, became, to his surprise, a local leader of a left faction in his town of Anata during the intifada, was arrested and tortured and held in prison like so many other young Palestinian men. And one of the things that Abed's story really shows, and that the stories of other Palestinian characters in this book also show, is the degree to which this system isn't just about controlling movement and making it difficult for you to plan your life or your day, or to know if you're going to, if it's going to take 20 minutes or 4 hours to get to a location that's not that far away from you because of the whim of an 18-year-old, 19-year-old Israeli soldier. Those things are obvious, but it also shows us, their stories show us, Abed's story shows us how this system reaches into the most intimate parts of Palestinian life. How at one point Abed even chooses a marriage partner because he's at risk of losing his job in Jerusalem, much higher paying job in Jerusalem, because of this tightening permit regime. And the only way he and his coworkers think they can hold on to their jobs is by marrying a Palestinian with the right color ID that would allow them to then get the right color ID and keep their jobs. And time and again, just hearing about the stories of the people affected by this crash, I was struck by how much the system of domination really colored every aspect of their lives. Mm. And that is a real central theme of the book that I hope that it brings across.
Mm. Yeah, you lay it out very, very nicely. Let's for listeners, I know because of recent events, everyone was becoming an expert on this, online, very annoyingly so. But you live there and stuff. Maybe for folks, kind of give us a little bit of the geography, so if people can imagine the strip of land of Israel. You have the Gaza Strip, if I'm not mistaken, on the shore, and then the West Bank covers, if you have the Dead Sea, and west of the Dead Sea, the West Bank, you have major cities like Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, I think, is there, and then in this area, in and around these cities, I think the area sprawls a little bit outward. It will be partitioned off for some folks that are Palestinian and some folks that are Israeli. And then all the way to the north, you have the Sea of Galilee and Golan Heights and things like that. Is that about right? Is there anything else here in the West Bank you want to say about? Maybe you can kind of describe. Maybe you can describe, Anata, and talk about this, separation wall in the center, the annexation of it, these 4 settlements, the military base, the segregated highway. Can you give more of the terrain here?
Sure. So before we zoom in on the town of Anata, I just want to zoom out, as you just did, to look at historic Palestine.
Yeah.
So that territory today has a single sovereign, the state of Israel. From the river to the sea, there's one sovereign. And the state of Israel, in its the current coalition's government program, it states explicitly that there shall only be one sovereign between the river and the sea. And in that territory, what you have is the state of Israel within its pre-1967 borders. So that is 78% of this territory of historic Palestine. The remaining 22% are what we call the occupied territories, which is Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And together, these make up 22%, but it's not that the Palestinians, with their limited self-governance, have limited autonomy in 22% of historic Palestine. It is that within that 22%, it is again carved up so that Palestinians in the West Bank have limited autonomy in 165 tiny little islands of varying degrees of autonomy, with overall Israeli control over that autonomy. Israel entering these areas at will, entering them nightly, making arrests within them, doing as it pleases within them. But overall, the Palestinians responsible for health and education and so forth in these little 165 islands. And those islands of Palestinian autonomy, so Gaza and the 165 islands in the West Bank, together make up 10% of the territory of historic Palestine. So that is what we have. Palestinians are more than half the population, just slightly, but they are more than half the population between the river and the sea, more than half the population under Israeli control. But they have limited autonomy in the occupied territories in about 10% of the overall territory under Israel's control. And within the West Bank, you have some territory that has been formally annexed by Israel. So that includes East Jerusalem, which was formally annexed in 1967, as well as the lands of over 24 surrounding villages. One of those villages is Anata, which Israel didn't annex fully. It didn't annex the entire territory of Anata. It annexed part of Anata. And again, to take a step back, the overall logic of Israeli settlement for many, many decades has been, in the Israeli phrase, maximum territory, minimum Arabs. And so the logic of annexation that took place in 1967, how you had all of these towns that were partially annexed, is that Israel wanted to take the most sparsely populated areas to grab as much land as it could, but it didn't want to take the Palestinian population itself, so the annexation line would tend to stop at the most densely populated part of a town. And this is the overall logic of settlement in the West Bank. You have Israeli settlement spreading over the least densely populated areas, and the most densely populated Palestinian areas, the urban centers. Israel takes a different approach, as it did with Gaza, as it does now with the town of Anata, the populated part of Anata, of controlling it from the outside, of enclosure, of fences, of walls, of restrictions on movement, but basically to try and make the occupation easier for Israel, they would grant autonomy in the city centers and allow Palestinians to govern their own health and education and other limited domains, while, of course, retaining overall security control. So every Israeli settlement in the West Bank is in what is called Area C. It's either in territory that has been formally annexed in 1967 or in Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, roughly a little bit more. And that 60% is contiguous. So it's one giant area of Area C that has every Israeli settlement, every Israeli military base, every Israeli settler road, every Israeli military firing zone, all the Israeli infrastructure in the West Bank is in Area C. And then dotting that contiguous area are these tiny little islands, 165 islands of Area A and B limited autonomy. So that's the basic overall picture that you have of Israel-Palestine. And then within a place like Anata, which is right next to Jerusalem, you have a whole array of different statuses to different pieces of land that Israel is controlling. So some of it has been formally annexed. A part of Anata is, as far as Israel is concerned, part of the sovereign capital of Israel, part of Jerusalem. Part of it has not been annexed and is considered Area C. Part of it has not been annexed and is considered Area B. And then you have on the lands of Anatta, you have Israeli settlements. These are officially sanctioned settlements by the state. And then you have the outposts that are supported by the state, that the state provides water and electricity and security for them, but they are have not been formally approved yet by the state. Often they're retroactively approved by the state. And so you have a bunch of outposts as well on the lands of Anatta. And you have this segregated highway, as I mentioned. You have the old spring of Anatta that is now an Israeli nature reserve, part of the Israeli National Park Authority. So you can have, Israelis in Tel Aviv will go to the spring, to the old spring of Anatta, which is part of an Israeli national park, and pay an admission fee to the Israeli National Park. The reason I'm mentioning these details is because often people have in their mind this notion that there's an Israel within its pre-67 borders, that's 78% of historic Palestine, and then there's the occupied territories which are under military rule and totally separate from the state. But this is absolutely not the case. There is a seamlessness between the settlements and the state of Israel. They have Israeli national bodies like the police, like the National Park Authority, who are running affairs in the West Bank. When you go in an Israeli settlement, you see Israeli road signs, you see Israeli fire stations, you see Israeli schools and health clinics. So it's about an absorption of the West Bank into the state of Israel. And some of it has been formally annexed, some of it hasn't been formally annexed, but it all looks like it's been annexed. And similarly with this ghetto that Anatta is part of, this walled ghetto, half of it has been formally annexed, half of it is not formally annexed, but all of it is one undifferentiated area of neglect. And what really counts is not the formal status that Israel has given these areas, but whether they're inhabited by Jews or by Palestinians. So the Palestinian area, it can be annexed, it can be not annexed, it's neglected. The Jewish area, whether it's annexed or not annexed, is thriving, growing, expanding.
It's obviously there's a lot there. That's some of that is very sobering. I guess the question I have here as I'm listening to this is, what's the steelman argument, I guess, for Israel for doing this? Right. We're talking 2025. This is currently how it is. Why are they? What is the rationale for the state of Israel to treat Palestinians this way? I mean, we don't have to get into the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and all these things. I mean, there's obviously a lot of political groups here, and there are some terrorist organizations, all these things. Okay. But I guess for regular people, like, regular Palestinians that live day in and day out, what's the rationale for Israel for doing this, for treating regular people that aren't involved in any of these things, for treating them this way? What's the rationale, I guess?
So I think, it really depends on which Israelis you're asking. You have members of the current Israeli government. You have, as I mentioned, the official document outlining the program of this government being very explicit that the goal is to have a single Jewish state from the river to the sea. Trump's former ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is also promoting the idea of a single Jewish state from the river to the sea. And that's the goal, with Palestinians either leaving or accepting some lesser status, absence of rights within the state.
And this is all predicated on the fact that it's Jewish land. It has been since 2,000 years ago. it's part of their identity, they have a sovereign right to it, etc., this kind of thing?
Yes. It's the claim isn't that it's been Jewish land for 2,000 years, but rather that there was a Jewish kingdom 2,000 years ago, and that after 2,000 years, Jews are returning to their ancestral homeland, and that their right to return after 2,000 years. And again, return is an abstract idea here. It's not that any single Jewish settler who arrived in Palestine could point to a home that their family had come from, or could even point to a town that their family had come from. It's an abstract notion of connection based on there having been Jewish kingdom 2,000 years ago, and that abstract connection supersedes the actual property rights of the people inhabiting the land at present. So it's often the case that liberal Israelis will express frustration or disapproval of the settlement program in the West Bank. That they'll say, this is against Israel's own interest because our supreme interest is to have a Jewish demographic majority. And that is what we value above anything else. And to have a bit more land at the expense of losing our Jewish demographic majority because maybe we'll be forced one day to give these people equal rights and will no longer be a majority. So that's the kind of line of the Israeli left that opposes the settlements. But if you ask them, what is the actual rationale for your opposing the settlements? This is what the settlers themselves will say to the Israeli center or center left. Their reasons for opposing the settlements, that the Bible is not a land deed, that the notion that God gave you this doesn't supersede the actual property rights of the people living here. Well, all of those arguments apply actually to the Jewish settlement that took place within Israel proper, within Israel and its pre-67 boundaries. And this is one of the real tensions within Israeli Jewish society and ideology, is that, the settlers say, look, we're just doing what the Israeli center left, what the Israeli labor movement was doing in Palestine long before the 1967 occupation began. And so there is a similar logic behind both of these forms of settlement. And so, again, it really depends on which Israelis you ask about what the overall idea is here. But again, even with the Israeli left or center left that prioritizes Jewish demographic supremacy, what they're really saying is that, so just to take a step back, in 1948, Jews were slightly less than a third of the population in historic Palestine. Palestinians were the remaining two-thirds. And in the civil strife that broke out in late 1947 and became the 1948 war that ended in 1949, in that process you had a massive ethnic cleansing where during that year, a Palestinian majority was turned into a minority overnight. And so 80% of the Palestinians who were in what became the boundaries of the State of Israel, that 78% of historic Palestine, 80% of them were forced to flee and or expelled and were not allowed to return. And so there's no dispute that a massive ethnic cleansing took place at the foundation of the State of Israel. And what the kind of Israeli center left is saying is, we will never give up on the gains of that ethnic cleansing. We would never let the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. We won that war. We got this great victory of turning a Palestinian majority into a minority, and we will never undo that. And their real objection to the settlement project is not really about the rights of Palestinians. It's about potentially jeopardizing that Jewish demographic majority, because one day, maybe, they'll somehow find themselves in a situation where it's impossible to divide the land. The whole world recognizes that it looks like, scrambled eggs. There is no possible land partition. And so the only realistic option is for people to have equal rights. And so that's the big fear of the Israeli center left.
Yeah, it's very complicated because there's a lot of history here. I mean, as I'm hearing this, I hear the arguments here, and it is curious because my understanding is this space in the world, now the State of Israel, has been dominated by many different people for many thousands of years. You had the Romans, you had the Crusaders, you had the Mamluks, and then you had the Ottomans for 600 years up until the end of World War I. And so you get to about 1920, and you then have this period where my understanding is that there are Muslims that are living there, and you have Palestinians, and so you have these folks that are living there. You have this throughout World War II. Obviously, you have a genocide of Jews by the Nazis, and as you mentioned, 1948. You have this Jewish diaspora and this idea of, well, as you were saying, this return. But I guess there's this question of like, it's a weird place it's a weird question to ask, but like, I guess I mean, it's not for you to answer, person. I'm kind of rhetorically asking this, but like, where do people, I guess, go? Like, people want to have a historic home of sorts, right? And I hear you about the land deed thing, but I guess both parties are always going to say, from time past, that Palestinians and Israel or Jews they see this space of land as theirs, as historically and culturally and all these things. I mean, how do we square that, right? Because people are, I mean, obviously both folks and people disagree with this on both sides here. You have Palestinians that disagree and Jewish people that disagree with this. They don't want any fighting of sorts. Where space, placement. How do we think of that? How do we? It's such a puzzling question to me as an outsider.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that there are a couple questions. One is a forward-looking question, and another is a backward-looking question. Mm-hmm. Now, the forward-looking question is, at present, you have a single sovereign ruling over 7.5 million Jews, 7.5 million Palestinians, roughly. That's the State of Israel, and it is slowly and steadily expanding its absorption of the West Bank with the explicit goal of making a Palestinian state impossible. And so, what kind of future can we imagine that would be just and equitable? Mm-hmm. And, the most obvious answer is, of course, that everybody live with equality, and that there be reparations, and that people are allowed to return to their homes and get lands back and compensation and all the rest. That is a total political non-starter for the more powerful party, Israel, which will never conceive of doing that unless it's forced to in some future where there are sanctions and all kinds of other things that are very distant from us now. So that's the kind of forward-looking question. And then there's a related question, which is a moral one, which is, is it equitable or just, given that you have more than half the population is Palestinian, that they should get 22% of the land? I mean, they're not even being offered the 22%. They're being offered much less than the 22%. But even to give more than half 22% is obviously not an equitable distribution. So that's a whole set of other questions about, how sustainable would that kind of a partition be in any event. And then there's a backward looking set of questions, which is, when the conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine began with the start of Zionist settlement in 1882, Jews were approximately 4 to 5% of the population, and the rest were the non-Jewish native majority. And that non-Jewish native majority did not want a Jewish state created on their land. And I don't think you would find any people anywhere in the world that would accept that there would be a state of immigrants, mainly from Russia and Europe, coming and taking over their land and declaring that it's their state for them that excludes you, the native people. And so I do think that there is a fundamental kind of moral question that one has to ask about the origins of this conflict, which is, was it just to create for that 5%, to allow that 5% to create, or if you take it up to a couple decades to the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when Jews were almost 10%, was it just to create a state for the Jews on this land against the will of the native majority? And I think the answer to that is no. And I think that if we ask, in any other place in the world, would we accept a 2,000-year-old claim, historical or religious, whatever kind of claim, to grant the rights of a bunch of people to come and take over a territory against the will of the people who are living there, we would say no. And in fact, even with much more recent claims, when it's, the claim for a greater Hungary or, some kind of revanchist program for an ethnic group to reacquire old lands, we oppose even that. So I don't think there's really a case that can be made, a non-religious case that can be made for the justness of creating a Jewish state in Palestine against the will of the native majority. Now, the fact is, it happened. Here we are today. You have a state of Israel. You have half the population's Palestinian, half the population's Jewish. And then in addition, you have these millions of refugees who aren't even being counted in that ratio of half and half. Millions of Palestinian refugees who aren't allowed to return not only to their homes, but anywhere in historic Palestine. And, getting to a potential resolution is going to take a real change in the way the world thinks about this issue and treats this issue, because at present what you have is a huge disparity in power between the two sides. Israel is a major military power. It has nuclear weapons. It is stronger than all its neighbors and feared in the region. And then you have the Palestinians who don't have a state, who don't have an army, who have very few allies and very few resources, and almost no ability to achieve their national goals, even the more limited one of just achieving a state on the 22% of their land. So as long as the world's still greatest power, the United States, is fully backing Israel as it's expanding and taking over more and more Palestinian land every week, as long as it's vetoing any kind of Security Council resolution that's calling for a halt to settlements or any other criticism of Israel, as long as it's funding the Israeli military and putting pressure on Western allies not to do any move against Israel, even the most limited thing like boycott settlement products alone, just settlement products. As long as that's the world that we're operating in, then we are just going to see this process continue of Israeli Jewish expansion, Palestinian constriction into smaller and smaller communities. And it's up to us to wake people up to the fact that we are aiding and abetting a process that looks a lot like what happened in North America to the Native Americans.
Yeah, it's something that is it's tough. It's a tough thing because you have what I keep coming back to is you have human beings living in this space that don't want any of this kinds of stuff. They want to be able to, live their lives like how me or anyone else lives their lives. Raise their family, worship how they worship, do what they want to do every day. And there some folks are and some folks aren't allowed to do this. And I think that's difficult. And there are different threats, I think, for both sides of this in different ways. I was curious. We mentioned it, but maybe I thought it was really eye-opening for me, you talk about in the book, is these color ID cards. I was kind of blown away by this. I didn't know about this. So there are different colored ID cards Israel uses to regulate the movement of Palestinians in the West Bank. When did that start? What's the rationale, and how do we see how it actually works? I mean, I bring this up because you mentioned in the book in terms of Abed and people he interacts with are having to. It's a reality. They're having to use this. So what's the kind of hierarchy here of this?
So, the overall Israeli system with respect to the Palestinians is that there are different statuses that Palestinians have that are more or less hierarchical in terms of what kinds of rights that Palestinians have. So the Palestinians who have the fewest rights are the Palestinian refugees outside of historic Palestine who can't even enter. Then next up the ladder are Palestinians in Gaza who had been living under siege for 17 years and have very little ability to move outside of Gaza and whose lives are highly restricted by Israel's control from the outside of Gaza. The next rung up the ladder are Palestinians in Area C of the West Bank who have to apply for an Israeli permit to build a balcony, to build an outhouse, to make any expansion of their home, to do anything. And those are almost never granted. And what you have is Israeli demolition of any Palestinian structure because they're built without a permit, which is never granted. And alongside it, you have Israeli Jewish homes being built in abundance, both those with permits and those without. And then the next level up are the Palestinians in the autonomy areas of the West Bank, in what's called Area A and B, and the kind of medium-sized towns and urban centers of the West Bank. And then they have greater control over their lives. They don't need to apply for a permit to build a balcony in their homes, but they can still be arrested at will by Israel, and Israel can come into their home and take their 12, 13-year-old child in the middle of the night for writing anti-occupation graffiti. Mm. The next level up are Palestinians in the areas that Israel has formally annexed. So that's East Jerusalem and the lands of these more than 24 villages. And they have freedom of movement within Israel and the West Bank. They can cross through the checkpoints that the settlers go through. They can move and they can work inside of Israel, and they have the right to vote in Israeli municipal, but not in national elections. And the final level up are the Palestinian citizens of Israel. These are the Palestinians who remained inside that 78% of historic Palestine that became the state of Israel in 1948. Mm-hmm. And those people have Israeli citizenship, and they don't have equal rights with Jews. They're roughly 20% of the citizens of the state of Israel, but they're constricted to 3% of the land, and Israel has a state project of Judaizing the areas in which they live, in particular the Negev desert and the Galilee, and to build Jewish settlements, as they do in the West Bank, right around Palestinian communities and box them in.
How are folks determined to fall into which category here in this hierarchy? It's
by birth. It's by birth. So if you were born in Gaza, you will be born with all of the restrictions of somebody in Gaza. You won't be able to go to a university in the West Bank unless you apply for months and months and maybe never get the permission from Israel to move from Gaza to the West Bank. And if you were born in Area A or B, you will be given a green color West Bank ID, and you will have the restrictions of movement that accompany that. That will mean you cannot enter Jerusalem without applying for a permit. You cannot go into Israel without applying for a permit. You can't enter certain areas of the West Bank. And if you are born in the annexed areas, then you will be given a blue color ID, which allows you greater freedom of movement and the ability to work inside of Israel and to vote in municipal elections. And you have families where you have some members have a green ID and some members have a blue ID. You have communities that are filled with members that have both green and blue IDs and with very different abilities to work and to move about. And then, of course, if you are born in the diaspora, if you are born to a Palestinian parent in Jordan or the United States or what have you, then you also are unable to enter Palestine to come and live there.
Yeah, that's so. It's just really it's luck. It's where you're born or where you're not born. Essentially, is kind of what it sounds like. There's no way of moving in between necessarily. I mean, obviously you could apply, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get anywhere with it. Which is again another, at the very least, sobering thought for folks here, because you have people that are born every day and they can't decide how these things work for them. It's not like so there really is limited autonomy there.
Yeah.
So really quick, just because you mentioned the book and it's it's important. You don't have to get into all the details. You can just kind of give us the broad brushstrokes here. You had the first Intifada. You mentioned it earlier in 1987. And there you do sort of talk about the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. You can talk about that, kind of what happened there. And we have a second Intifada in 2000, I believe, until 2005. I think that's right. Maybe just loosely from this perspective as it relates to the story here, because Abed gets kind of mixed up in the first one, but yeah, what's the, I guess, from this perspective, the significance of both of these, I guess, there's you're going to have people have different opinions about it depending on who you talk to, but generally, how do you kind of see this?
Yeah. So these were two very, very important events in the history of Israel-Palestine. And from 1967, when the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began, until 1987, Israel had a fairly easy and quiet occupation. There was very little resistance. And what happened in December 1987 is there was a traffic accident in Gaza. 4 Palestinians were killed. Because of the circumstances, it looked like it was a deliberate killing. It involved an Israeli army convoy, and a set of protests broke out in Gaza, and these protests began to spread, and they spread and spread throughout Gaza and the West Bank. And Palestinians began to organize. They began to strike. The labor unions were very strong at the time. The Palestinian workforce was an important part of the Israeli economy, so they had real leverage with their labor strikes. They organized boycotts. They shut down roads. They made it much, much more difficult for Israel to maintain its occupation. They forced the Israeli army to send in many, many more troops than they had used in the past to control the Palestinians. And because the uprising lasted and proved to be sustainable, it started to change the thinking of Israeli leaders, including the Israeli defense minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, and the Israeli prime minister, Yitzhak Shamir. Both of them came to the conclusion during the Intifada that there was some new modality that they would have to reach in order to control the Palestinians, because this wasn't working anymore. And Rabin had told his aides that he decided as a result of the Intifada that they needed to create some form of Palestinian autonomy. And the prime minister, Shamir, also came up with an autonomy plan at that time. And out of that first Intifada, what was born was the first Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza. This is the creation of what is called the Palestinian Authority through the Oslo Accords. And it came about through the success of the Intifada, through Palestinian pressure. Now, there were many critics of the Oslo Accords. There were many critics of the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian critics, who foresaw that this was not, as it was being sold, the germ of a future Palestinian state, but rather a means of control in a more indirect way for Israel, a way for them to sustain the occupation even longer, to deprive Palestinians of rights even longer. And that actually is also, it was Abed's view. He was against Oslo, and he believed that it would mean, for him personally, greater restrictions on movement in his own life. He had already experienced during the Intifada. He was arrested and tortured, held in prison, and when he got out, he got a different colored ID card for people who had been in prison. And that ID card, when he tried to exit his town of Anata to go to the checkpoint, he'd get beaten by the soldiers there because he had the card that showed he'd been in prison. So he was, in effect, trapped in his community because of this ID card. And he saw that Oslo was going to be a system that was going to have more cards and more permits and more restrictions on movement under the guise of autonomy. And it should be said also, I mentioned that that Oslo was being marketed as the germ of a Palestinian state. That was only in people's, imaginations. It wasn't actually on paper. There was never a mention of Palestinian statehood, no promise of Palestinian statehood in Oslo. It was merely, we were going to create an autonomy system that is going to last for 5 years, and by the end of that 5 years, there will have to be some permanent arrangement reached without specifying what it was. And the prime minister, he was formerly the defense minister, became the prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin. He was prime minister at the time of Oslo. He explicitly stated that what he envisioned was not a state for Palestinians, was less than a state. Those were his words. And he said that Jerusalem would remain the unified, undivided capital of Israel, meaning no Palestinian capital in Jerusalem, without which there is no Palestinian state, that Israeli troops would control the eastern borders of the Palestinian entity, that they would remain in the Jordan Valley, that the major Israeli settlement blocks would stay in place. So when you hear all of those factors, what you understand is that the vision of Israel, even the patron saint of the Israeli left, was for a glorified autonomy for Palestinians and not actual independence. So that was the first intifada, and it was an intifada largely of stone-throwing boys facing Israeli soldiers in tanks with M16s.
Two final questions. One's a two-parter, but so the intifada ends in 2005. Right? The second intifada ends in 2005. Hamas gets elected in 2006 and has been there since. Not to talk too much about current events, but it would be remiss not to mention it. I mean, obviously, October 7th was pretty terrible. I don't know. I guess the general question I have here is you have we don't want people to kill each other. We don't want that, obviously. And I think it'd be reasonable to understand that everyday Palestinians living this way would be frustrated, is to put it mildly. Obviously, massacring people is not the answer either. So, yeah, I mean, the response from the state of Israel since then has been, devastating. And the argument I hear for this is, a terrorist organization of Hamas has said that they're going to just continue. Every day is going to be October 7th. We're just going to continue doing this. And so the state of Israel has claimed that, we're just going to take them out. And, at whatever costs, including women, children, refugee camps, hospitals, schools, because they place, their headquarters on the ground, all this stuff. And so we've been seeing this for over a year. Just a general statement. I mean, anything you want to say about generally, anything that's happened in the past year, since October 7th, over the past year, what are we doing? When can we get all this to stop? I mean, how do we move forward? I guess from this. I mean, it's complicated, of course, but a lot of loss.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
So I think what we are witnessing is an acceleration of this process that's been happening for decades, which is Israeli Jewish expansion and Palestinian constriction. And we are witnessing an ethnic cleansing that's taking place in Gaza. Those are the words even of the right-wing former defense minister in Israel, Moshe Ya'alon, is saying that it's ethnic cleansing. And the wholesale destruction of Gaza, making the place uninhabitable for human life. That is what has happened. And there are many indications that the ground is being prepared for Israeli settlements to return to Gaza. We have Israeli land confiscation in the West Bank is at record highs right now. In the last year alone, Israel has confiscated more Palestinian land in the West Bank than in the previous 20 years combined. At the same time, you have more than 24 Palestinian communities in the West Bank forcibly removed, do not exist any longer, just gone. So its own ethnic cleansing taking place in parallel in the West Bank. And now we have a Trump administration coming in, which is only going to give Israel even more support as it pursues this program. Not that it faced any opposition, any real opposition from Biden, but going to get even more support, full-throated support from Trump. So what we're seeing is, again, this is a battle over all of historic Palestine that Israel is winning, and it intends to win. It wants total victory. Now, it hasn't figured out what it's going to do with all these Palestinians. It's, ethnically cleansed northern Gaza, and now you have a bunch in the south. It would love for those people in southern Gaza to move to other countries. There's ethnic cleansing taking place in parts of the West Bank, but it hasn't figured out what it's going to do with the millions of Palestinians that are under its control. And it is conceivable that there will be a great deal more ethnic cleansing in the future. And so I think that we have to be very clear about what the stakes are, what it is that we're witnessing, and not to be in denial of it and to be using frameworks, discussion of two states and of returning to a peace process, and that there being bad settlers and good Israel within its pre-67 borders, and all of these kind of old tropes that we've heard for decades in the Western media, and really look clearly at the situation. And the clear situation is that when we plot on a line, what has happened since 1967, it is a process of steady Israeli Jewish expansion and Palestinian constriction. And that process now is in turbo drive. So just project out a few years forward, a couple decades forward, and you're looking at a very, very bleak future.
I guess my last question here is a two-parter. What would you want to say to Jewish folks in Israel and around the world, including the U.S.? What's your message to them? And what's your message to Palestinian folks in and around Israel and around the world?
I think that the message to all Americans, and in particular to American Jews, is that we as Jews are complicit in what is happening. The Israeli government is saying that it's doing it in our name. The leading American Jewish institutional organizations are supporting the U.S. government policy of giving carte blanche to the Israeli government to destroy Gaza using American weapons, using American tax dollars, and to expand over the West Bank with the explicit goal of preventing any kind of Palestinian liberty and independence. So, that is what we as Americans and what American Jews are complicit in, and I think we have a responsibility to try to stop it. We, have a lot to answer for, and I don't think there is sufficient appreciation of the degree to which we are responsible for this. The U.S. could have stopped this war in its first weeks. The Israeli government needed resupply of American weapons in the first weeks of the war, and it couldn't have waged it without the U.S. support. Mm. So, when there are legal actions taken against Israeli leaders for the war crimes that are being committed, Western leaders, American leaders, are complicit and are also liable. And we, as citizens of those states, ought to make sure that our leaders and our governments are not supporting war crimes in our name. And, I think that for Palestinians in the diaspora, what I would say is that they're making a tremendous difference. That what one of the few rays of hope that Palestinians have seen in the last 15 months have been the protests in Western capitals on American college campuses. I don't know if you saw, but there were videos in Gaza of Gazans holding up signs thanking the American college student protesters. Mm. It was one of the only positive things that anyone could point to, and unfortunately, it's a very, very long road. But I do see that there are some positive changes being made thanks to those efforts in the right direction. Mm.
Well, Nathan, I mean, I really, really appreciate you giving me your time and your energy, and your book is great, and you're telling important narratives and stories that we need to hear, that the rest of the world isn't hearing, regardless of where people's beliefs or opinions are. And you're sharing the reality of how people live, and we need to hear that and be informed. So big thanks for giving me your time and your wisdom. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure to speak to you.
Absolutely.